Shabbat Shalom once again. So, often I will receive calls or emails from people that say to me, Rabbi, how do I know, or how can I tell if God is listening to me? How do I know that he even wants to have a relationship with me? Very good question. It certainly puzzles some people, because some people, if they don't have a physical interaction, they find it difficult to understand the concept of a sort of an esoteric connection. But this week we start reading the new book of the Torah of Leviticus. And in Hebrew, both the book of the Torah and this week's Parshat have the same name. It's called Vayikra. Vayikra literally means, and he called. Now, it opens with God calling to Moses from the tent of meeting, and then speaking to Moses and giving him instructions for the various sacrificial offerings. And being as I went through them in detail last night, I'm not going through them again now. Most of the time that God speaks to Moses, it starts with the familiar phrase, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses saying. Why does the Torah in a few places, including here, begin with God calling to Moses? Now Rashi explains that it's a way of expressing affection. Just as you might call out to a loved one, God was calling out to Moses. We see calling as a sign of affection in a pasuk from the prophet Isaiah, which is very familiar to us because it is part of the Kedusha that we recite in the Amidah. And if we had in-house services, we would be doing it today, but we don't have in-house services yet. But we certainly do it every morning. And now in the Menacha in the afternoon services on Zoom. What do we say? V'kara ze el ze v'amar Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Adonai Tzavaot Meloch ha'aretz kavodo. Which means, and they called to one another, Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. The whole world is filled with his holy glory. Now, this is not the first time that God calls to Moses. The first time was in the beginning of the book of Exodus, when Moses encounters God for the first time at the burning bush. Now, Moses sees a bush burning with fire, yet the Torah says, V'hasneh einenu ukal, which means that the bush was not consumed. Moses turned to take a closer look at this amazing sight, and then the Torah tells us the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, and God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And what does Moses do once he recovers from the initial shock? He says, Hineni, here I am. Now, Christians often use the language of calling. They would describe this moment as the point in time where Moses was called to God's service. And I have to tell you, my Christian colleagues will talk about an experience of when they were called to the ministry. Now, Jews, for the most part, don't use the language of calling. Sort of a rabbi is more likely to talk about how he or she decided to become a rabbi, not how or when they were called to be a rabbi. But as we can see from the fact that the language of calling is found in multiple places throughout the Torah, and it's God calling people, having a calling is actually a very Jewish thing. Now, what does it mean to be called by God? Does God only call to us to take on some religious task, such as being a rabbi, or perhaps joining the board of a synagogue, or teaching in a religious school? those aren't the only ways to serve God. Now, not everyone has to be a rabbi, and your calling does not have to be your primary career. It's entirely possible to be called to serve God in your spare time. How do we hear God calling? Now, for Jews, the answer is we hear God calling through the Torah. We see the Torah as a bridge between God and man, between the infinite and the ineffable, and the finite and the concrete. That's why we treat the Torah with such reverence. It's not just a book. It's the connection between God and ourselves. There's a beautiful teaching that's brought down from the Zohar, which is the central work of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And the following translation, which I'm going to read to you, is from Daniel Matt. Now, listen to it carefully. You could substitute God for Torah, as Torah is simply the vehicle for connecting with God. And he translates a section as follows. Human beings are so confused in their minds. They do not see the way of truth in Torah. Torah calls out to them every day in love, but they do not want to turn their heads. Even though I have said that Torah removes a word from her sheath, is seen for a moment, and then quickly hides away that it is certainly true. But when she reveals herself from her sheath and hides herself right away, she does not only for those who know her and recognize her. Sounds a little bit convoluted, but that's from the Zohar, which is the mystical text. The opening passage, human beings are so confused in their minds, tells us that God calls to us, but only calls to those who are ready to receive the call. And it takes some preparation. Here's a parable. To what can this be compared? We're told to a princess, beautiful in every way and hidden deep within her palace. She has one lover, unknown to anyone. He is hidden too. Out of his love for her, this lover passes by her gate constantly, lifting his eyes to every side. She knows that her lover is hovering about her gate constantly. So, how is it that we hover about her gate? And the way we do it is through the studying of Torah. Not every second that we study Torah, not every moment that we seek God is going to be an awe-filled, transcendent moment. There's a fair amount of hovering or just being there, being ready for that moment when we can detect God is calling us. Now, the rabbis teach that the famous story of the burning bush, the bush was a spectacle out in the open that was visible for anyone to see. The Midrashes tell us that other people saw the burning bush and didn't pay any attention to it. They said, "Oh, it's another bush on fire in the desert. It happens." Maybe they didn't look at it long enough to see that it wasn't being consumed by the fire. Moses was the one who paused, who saw the wonder, saw God, and thus heard the calling. Now, sometimes we can hear God calling. But you know what? We're still, for some reason, disinclined to answer the call. A calling can often be something difficult. It can be something transformative, something that might upend your normal life. Look at Abraham. What was Abraham told to do? He was told, Lech lecha miyartzcha miyoladcha beit avicha. Get up, go, leave your father's house, leave the land which you were born in, and go to a place which I will show you. I mean, Let's be totally honest. If your spouse woke you up first thing in the morning and told you we're packing up and we're leaving, and you say, well, where are we going? And you said, well, I don't really know, but I did have this, I heard this in the night. I heard a calling. I mean, come on, let's be totally honest. You would think your spouse is crazy. You'd probably call 911. But Abraham realized he heard the calling. So yes, sometimes it's transformative. Sometimes it's a very difficult thing to do. And as I said, sometimes it will even upend your normal life. When God called to Moses from the burning bush and told him that he had a job for him, what was Moses' first reaction? Moses' initial reaction was to turn it down. God calls Moses, and Moses hears the call. But at first, what does he do? He rejects the call. He says, no way. He says, not me. And what did he do? He offered one excuse after the other why he couldn't do it. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? That's what he said to God. Moses then complains that he doesn't even know God's name. He argues that the people won't believe him. He says, I have a speech impediment. They won't even understand me. They'll make fun of me. They'll mock me. Moses is clearly more than a little reluctant to answer God's calls. Moses' feeling of inadequacy of the task that God's asking, are also shown in this week's Torah reading, in this week's Parshat. In the opening of the opening word of the Parshat, the word Vayikra, the Aleph, you can look at it in your Chomashim if you have them. The Aleph at the end of the word is written with a smaller than usual letter in the Torah. Now, an explanation given for this small Aleph is that Moses wanted to write Vayikra, and it happened without the Aleph. God said, no. This is not a casual encounter. I was calling you. You chose to listen. Write it with the Aleph. When God calls to us, we may feel inadequate, not up to the task. We can feel that it's humbled by the fact that God wants us to take on such a task. We may be tempted to use as an excuse everything under the sun not to answer the call. However, it's better to have the confidence that if God calls you to do something, God will provide you with the tools and the resources to get the job done. Just as the burning bush was burning for anyone who chose to stop and look at it, but it was ignored by everyone passing by it before Moses. You need to understand that God is calling to each of us all the time, every day, and every minute of every day. It's just you need to turn and be prepared to listen. So the question is not, did God hear my prayer? Did God listen to me? The question should be, was I listening to God? And with that, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.